morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you had a very Merry Christmas. We are using time travel.
We have skipped past Christmas from an earlier date, and here we are, Robin.
The danger is if we introduce a time travel paradox. If we say something that does not come to pass, we might rip apart the fabric of the universe, and we'll have to get like the Avengers in here with the time stone or something.
We'll slide down a vortex, never to return.
We don't want that to happen. Or do we? Maybe we've been tearing at the fabric of the multiverse all along. But in the meantime, we are going to talk about the expensive taste of Gen Z. A recent Empower survey found that Gen Zers aspire to have a six-figure annual salary. The financial services firm interviewed people in that group. 2,000 respondents said they would need $587,000 to be financially successful. I wonder if that's a yearly income of that amount of money or just arrive at that amount of money.
Quite
I'm not
substantial.
sure. Well, wanting champagne on a beer budget might explain why there's been a shift from left to right among young voters. This group grew up in the age of social media and endless digital comparisons to more glamorous lives those apps have enabled. Plus, growing up amid financial and healthcare crises, along with student loan debates and housing affordability, are more factors that shaped Gen Z's attitudes about money.
According to Empower, half of those surveyed believe they are less successful than those around them, and that it's more difficult for their generation to obtain prosperity. So it's not hard to understand the ideological shift among Gen Zers. Recent data from Gallup and the Walton Family Foundation suggests that Gen Z teens are twice as likely to identify as conservative than their parents. 14% of 13 to 17-year-olds reported being more conservative than their parents. And when the same question was posed to millennials 20 years ago, 7% of 13 to 17-year-olds reported being more conservative. Those findings are consistent with voter turnout in the 2024 presidential election. According to Tufts Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, 39% of young voters voted Republican this year, compared to a smaller 30% who did so 4 years ago in 2020.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The shift to the right among much younger people is clearly evident from the data. There are a couple reasons I have for that. Certainly, I think some of the policy or economic changes, maybe we'll circle back to those. I do think that's a part of it. Another part of it is that I just think that Democrats, liberals, that coalition does not have at the moment like a lot of appealing national figures to attract people to that side and that ideology. If you think of, for millennials like myself, the millennial generation had Barack Obama, and then even Bernie Sanders for even more seriously progressive people making a big splash in the later 20-teens. He's still kind of on the scene, sort of, but his moment is a little bit past. I'm not insulting him to say that. The movement he created has subsided to some degree, and there just isn't another Obama-like figure on the horizon for the Dems, I think.
I think that is probably true. I think there are other elements to the story. I do think that AOC would be the most obvious example of a younger person who has that kind of charisma, but she is more a creature of the left, even though she has been moderated.
And a creature explicitly of politics. Barack Obama was a cultural figure. He was everywhere. He was bringing people in who weren't politics focused. If you're a politics focused young person at all open to liberal ideas, then you know who AOC is. You know who these people are. But your Obamas were and Bernie was reaching into a podcasting environment. We didn't understand the importance of it at the time. That was just beyond, and was bringing people in. Whereas I think that's less of a presence now. Whereas Trump is an omnipresent cultural figure, and a lot of people now explicitly associated with the right, like Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, and every person that a young person might be listening to on a podcasting alternative platform has increasingly some degree of right-wing politics.
Well, to that point, I do think that the changing media diet of different generations does play a part in this as well. It is obvious that young people are more inclined to get their news not only from podcasts, but from TikTok, platforms like that. I'm not denigrating those platforms. I think every generation finds its way to receive information and finds a way to get that information that seems comfortable and authentic to them. But I do think that in the podcast space in particular, you do have the Joe Rogan type figures and all sorts of people who are, it's unfair to say imitators, but cut from generally similar cloth. And I think that those people are generally right of centre, even though, of course, Rogan did endorse Bernie Sanders back in the day. Related to that, though, Robbie, I do wonder, I mean, from a Democratic perspective, this is quite worrisome. The idea that the Democrats have somehow become the party of the status quo, at least in the public imagination, I think that's pretty corrosive for young voters who typically are excited or intrigued by people who want to upset the apple cart a bit.
Yeah, the party of the status quo. They're also the party, or it's broader than the party, the ideological coalition of, like, there's something nagging or hectoring about the kind of vibe they put out there in the atmosphere, if that makes any sense. I think that was a problem Kamala Harris had. Not that I think she's a necessarily nagging individual herself, but just that was the general vibe. We should also talk about, I mean, the economic reality does matter. So Gen Z has it worse, certainly in some ways. Now, millennials also had a pretty bad situation. I graduated college in 2010.
The hard
and
times.
We had to walk 10
Young
ways
Nobel.
uphill through snow to do it. But no, it was at a time where the economy had really collapsed, really and truly collapsed to a much greater degree than they're seeing now. The job market was terrible. The housing market was terrible. Now, young people today, it is harder than ever. It's just continued to get harder to buy a house. That's an important marker of achievement and success that young people are thwarted in, that I would address by easing restrictions on building new housing and some other policies of that nature. If you're a young person trying to start a family, it's harder to get childcare costs more, education costs more, labor-intensive services have just gotten more and more expensive relative to a lot of consumer goods. Like now you have better access to electronics and technology, and kids today wouldn't even believe the lack of communication technology we had when we were growing up. Although some people would say maybe that was a good thing. You had to actually go outside, play with people, had to get a driver's license, had to skin your knees and learn something about resiliency or that whole argument, and that maybe kids don't have that opportunity because it's so easy to talk to people.
Yeah, but to your point about the economics, though, I think that feeds into what we were just talking about. It is harder for young people to afford a home. The job market in some ways is still has a lot of instability about it. Issues like childcare and all of that are obviously still relevant. So too for people who are working toward in less well-paid jobs. I mean, things like the minimum wage are real issues. So if you are a comparatively young person and you've had now years of this dissatisfaction, you presumably want to change the system because the system doesn't seem to be working to your benefit. And I would argue that it is to the detriment of the Democratic Party, of course, that it somehow hasn't really tapped into that anger and dissatisfaction, which it should be able to. I mean, I think that many of its policies, broadly speaking, are better aimed or more effective, or likely to be more effective at dealing with some of those issues, but it hasn't been able to make that resonate and to create the image that it's actually doing something. It is not the insurgent party, it is the establishment party, and that's a real problem.
Well, we are not going to use our newly discovered time travel powers to fix any of those problems, sadly, but we will have more rising coming up right after this. It's been a no good, horrible, very bad year for the Democratic Party. Republicans have locked in a trifecta for at least the next 2 years, but small majorities in the House and Senate means they will need to be unified to pass the GOP's priorities. But where does this leave the Democrats?
So the answer to that remains to be seen, but if the roster of Democratic lawmakers planning to skip President-elect Trump's inauguration is any indication, Democrats aren't planning to play nice with Republicans. The GOP may need 1 or 2 Dems, of course, when it comes time to vote. According to Axios, 13 Democrats will not attend the inauguration ceremonies, 20 are undecided, while 44 say that they will go. Here to discuss the road ahead for Democrats is a national political reporter for Semafor, David Weigel. Welcome, David.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you with us. So in terms of this inauguration story for a start, and Democrats pondering whether or not to show up or not, what do you make of that story and the general contours and what it says about where Democrats stand right now?
I knew it was coming, both because of the way Democrats talked after 2020 and because I think I was in the hallway when Axios was asking some Democrats that question. I was next to Jamie Raskin as he got it, and I said, I'm not going to steal that story. So here we are. This is a response by individual Democrats. It's very different from the way the White House reacted. And there was a lot of liberal and progressive dissatisfaction with how the White House reacted to Donald Trump winning. It is not in the Constitution that you need to invite the winner of the election to the White House, to the Oval Office for a meeting. It is not. It is. There are a lot of niceties that Trump never did for any opponent. The Democrats did for Donald Trump, and I found this with congressional Democrats. There are people who just are not going to bother to show up to anything that Trump does. Remembering not just January 6th, but in the final year of his presidency in 2020, there were a lot of bipartisan achievements in the House. A lot of expensive ones, where Republicans showed up for the signing ceremony, Democrats weren't invited. And this is not a president who's going to begin by doing a ton of outreach to Democrats. The only ones who feel any pressure to listen if there is outreach are the 9 Democrats might be a little bit more in the final count in places he won. And there are just far fewer than there were in 2017 who felt like they needed to put on a show, at least, of working with Trump.
At the same time, the appetite for just like outright defiance and organizing and, rioting in the streets seems very low compared to 2016. And even some of the more progressive, depends on what the issue is, I guess, but lefter leaning in some sense, or some more fans among the left Democrats like Bernie Sanders even and Ro Khanna have said more conciliatory things, or have talked about, are there areas where, for instance, we can work with Elon Musk to cut, let's say, the defense budget. I'm seeing from some of the ostensibly more progressive people a desire to work it out, get things accomplished, that it's definitely not let's go fight them in the streets kind of attitude. Is that characteristic of the party at large, or is that just a couple, eclectic individuals?
It starts the eclectic individuals, and they've got a strategy. You mentioned a couple people, Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, who I talked to Raskin, who I was mentioning prior to this. He said there are some Democratic reforms, small d Democratic voting reforms, that maybe Republicans will listen to now because they've won the popular vote and they're not going to be as dedicated to the Electoral College. That is a response by some Democrats, and what they're trying to do is highlight things that Trump talked about in the campaign, take some credit if they pass them. If they don't pass them, if Republicans in Congress don't supply the votes to pass them, then say, well, we tried to do that and Republicans lied about it in 2024. Vote for us in 2026, and we actually will. They're going to try this with, for example, cap on credit card rates, with free IVF, with a number of things that Trump talked about. No taxes on tips. I just was talking to outside conservative activists before the weekend who are already nervous that the Trump administration might do corporate tax cuts, but not do some of the more, progressive tax cuts that Trump ran on. And so that's their strategy. Let's talk about that. That does not mean have a great event with Donald Trump where you're seen working with him. But they're really not worried, as they were in 2017. If they show up with Trump and they work with him, it's gonna hurt them inside the party. The party does feel, and the party is represented by the grassroots, pretty enervated by what happened in the election. Having covered a couple of these transitions, having covered very closely the resistance in 16, 17, every Democrat agrees that they're just not in the same mindset. They're not going home and having the people ask them, how are you going to resist every single person? If you're in the House, you don't get to vote in the nominees. You don't need to worry about that.
Dave, anytime a party loses a presidential election, there's always, quite a lot of soul searching and self-interrogation, and often rather a lot of infighting. How do you read that debate that's going on within Democratic circles right now, specifically in relation to whether, the left of the party has in a sense, had its case strengthened by the loss of Kamala Harris, who I think staked out a fairly sort of center-left position, or conversely, is there a sense that some of the social justice elements perhaps shifted a bit too far to the left for people's liking, for voters' liking, and so, they have to shore up the center ground there?
Well, it depends which Democrat you're talking to, because among the non-progressives, and this is a broad group of people, this is the New Democrats, But this is also a lot of people who are part of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and don't agree with every one of their priorities. They were organizing to blame a couple of ideas that they said got too much traction in the party and the administration and are responsible for their defeat. They would like there to be a Democratic Party in 26, 28 that runs against some of the Biden administration's policies on, to pick the two controversial ones, I guess, on immigration and on gender identity. And they did not find a lot of takers. They were very vocal in the weeks after the election saying there are some policies the party needs to shift on. They did not find people in the party saying we agree. The general tenor in the party, and this is progressives, but this is also kind of rank and file who don't want to get into fights, is that Republicans use social issues to divert the working class away from things Democrats might work for them on. We need to emphasize our working class agenda. We need to highlight, as I was saying before, things that Trump is going to do that they can take credit for, or things that Trump will be stopped by the far right from doing that they can say they would do. And they don't. I want to be careful my theys here. The leadership of the Democratic Party does not want to get into this discussion. This is why there are so many off the record or anonymous quotes, or just as unhelpful quotes from James Carville, who's 80 and doesn't have a role in the party leadership. No, they're very muddled. You're finding that having no leader of the party who is interested in moving them in a high profile way, that matters. And you're seeing from Democrats who might run for president in 2028 a little more criticism. You're seeing this from Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, who unsurprisingly but interestingly has taken some moments to say he wouldn't have, for example, commuted the sentence of everyone that Biden commuted last week, that some of them were mistakes. There's a conversation that Democrats would like to have right now that I think they're not going to have until they start running in primaries. For the moment, they're really, not that the election was that shocking, but every one of their advocacy groups has been wrong about something. They're dealing with a world where the people that they held meetings with for 4 to 8 years or their whole careers, advising them on a certain immigration policy, a certain policy about sequencing border security over citizenship, where they were all wrong about the politics. And the result is that they're just very confused about how to act.
Who is going to be the leader of the Democratic Party moving forward? I had the expectation that Kamala Harris would, head off into the sunset now. But what we're hearing from members of her team is that she does want to remain part of the conversation. There's now talk of her perhaps running for governor of California in 2 years. Now, if she does that, she would not likely be running for president again in 2028, although I guess anything's possible. I did not really see her making a shot at the presidency either, but it sounds like she's maybe not finished. Is she going to be an enduring part of the conversation in a leadership role in the party moving forward, given that if it's not her, it's kind of divided among a couple people, your Shapiros, your Whitmers, et cetera, and, Biden's exiting the stage, obviously.
There's not one voice to the party, which is, I think, an advantage to Democrats. In 2017, they were getting the same question, who is the leader of the Democratic Party? And they didn't have a good answer, in part because the most powerful Democrat in Congress was Nancy Pelosi, and she was unpopular, and Democrats didn't want to be tied to her in every single race. And the answer is more sincere this time, because, yes, Harris is in a different position than Hillary Clinton. No matter what you might read in a viral article, Clinton was never going to run for president after losing in 2016. She wasn't going to run things behind the scenes. She was done, and she was blamed in the party for blowing a winnable election. Harris is viewed with, I'd say, anger over how the campaign spent money, which is not entirely her fault, but as the candidate, you own some of that. And less faulted over the ideological position she took. I was talking to Democrats on the record last week, these governors who think they could have run a better campaign, and their only real advice was, she should have broken with Biden harder on immigration in some high-profile way, which is very different than Hillary Clinton having the list of things she screwed up over the course of the campaign. No, so Democrats respect her as more than the average person who lost a campaign. It's a little bit more like Al Gore losing in 2000. The respect they have for her, or John Kerry losing. That doesn't mean she's going to lead the party, and she has not. She has a megaphone available to her right now. She's not using it for many things whatsoever. She didn't invite J.D. Vance to the vice president's residence, which was a choice. Talking to California Democrats, they have an open race for governor after Gavin Newsom. They have a number of candidates running who just aren't well known, and she could jump into that. The question is really, and this is one of the reasons she lost. Maybe we can't easily answer this. What kind of politician is Kamala Harris? Why is she doing this? Does Kamala Harris want to leave her legacy in politics as I was a successful governor of California who did a bunch of hard things that the state needs to have done? Or is it I'm going to make some money on speeches, which I certainly can do, and never run again? They don't know, and Harris's world, which morphed, but by the end it was pretty tight with some of her advisors. Remember, she has a lot of advisors who are gone and were critical of how she governed. Those people just don't think she had the talent to win a national election because of that question. Because what did she get into politics to do? She got into politics to be a prominent person. She was talked about as the future of the party as long ago as 2008, when people were saying who's the next Obama. But what did she do with that? Does she actually want to get in there and make change? Does she need to for her and her family's happiness? The final thing I'd say is some Democrats, when I ask them about Harris, they say this was a short campaign for her, and that was good. A freakishly short campaign where she doesn't have to compete in primaries and make mistakes is good for her. And between the lines of what Democrats don't even want to say on the record is they don't think she has the talent that the other people on deck do. The other governors already looking to run for president, they think would have done a better job in this campaign, and they can move on from her. So I hear a little bit more about what does she want to do this for? If she has a real drive, she should fix California rather than run again for president.
So this is fascinating, David, because I think that this goes to an interesting point for a lot of us, which is how serious a problem do Democrats think they have writ large in terms of the party's positioning. And I do take the point that sometimes parties can get into too much of a tailspin after they lose elections. I'm showing my age here, but the first election I covered in this country was 2004. George W. Bush won re-election at a time when he was despised by Democrats and liberals. And there was this whole freak out about, oh, can Democrats win again? This is just an endlessly center-right country. Well, turns out, 4 years later, 2 wars go bad, the economy starts to go off the rails, Democrats have Barack Obama, and it's an easy win. So it is possible to, I think, overreact to election defeats. But of course, it's also possible to underreact to them, right? For a party to be disconnecting with the public and sort of kidding itself that things are going to be okay just naturally or organically, that they don't have to take corrective action. So in your reporting, where do you think Democrats kind of lie on that spectrum at the moment?
Well, it's a good question because I'm thinking of 2020, this point in 2020, the Republicans who would admit that Joe Biden won, which wasn't all of them, they did not see inflation coming. They thought that Biden was going to inherit a very good economy coming back from COVID. There was a line that Mitch McConnell started to use after Biden's initiatives came out. If you just sat there and did nothing, the economy would have recovered. They really thought people are bad at predicting what arrangement of facts is going to be helpful for Trump. In the Middle East, for example, is it helpful? Would it have been helpful for Joe Biden to come in 4 years ago with Assad out of power and Russia without a client state? Probably. Trump is luckier in a couple of the things that he's going to deal with than Democrats thought. They do not put a lot of faith in this polling right now that says that voters are fairly happy with transition. They believe it's correct, but it's not that high. When Trump's response to the election has not been to reach out to anyone who didn't vote for him. He talked about putting a libertarian in the cabinet to win over the Libertarian Party's vote, and he didn't do that. So he's put in loyalists who they think will make mistakes, and that gets the situation you're talking about. What is the mistake down the horizon that Trump makes? What's the commitment he does? Is it tariffs and deportations that lead to higher prices for people? Is that what does it? That would be an easy comeback for them. That's when I hear Democrats say what would happen that put them back into power quickly. It would be Trump implements some ideas, they don't work, and they get to run as the remember when prices were lower in 2024 party, which is a winner, which lets you paper over a lot of your unpopular social issues. No, that's I'd say of the theories Democrats are throwing around, because that one involves no or little reform of what they believe and what they run on. That's pretty popular with Democrats now. They don't know what's going to happen. They're not terribly afraid that this is a party that's going to rule forever. The only aspect of that question they're afraid about is for about 20 years they said, well, here's the electoral map. If we keep improving in Texas and we can win back Florida, we can win a giant majority. The election, they got much further away from ever winning Texas or Florida with this arrangement of voters, with this popularity among Latinos. And so the demographic comeback of the party, we're going to fall over the finish line because of how white voters are becoming less and less of the electorate. They don't say that in this difference in 2004. You could already talk to Democrats 20 years ago saying, yeah, but look at the trends. This is going to be a much more Democratic country in 10, 20 years. With that being untrue, that's what worries them. They just are waiting for Trump to make something so disastrous that they can run easily against it.
Yeah, if demographics are destiny, the Democratic Party is effed. David Weigel, Semafor, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Here's a shocking story. New mothers are being given drugs at hospitals only to find themselves reported to child abuse authorities for being on those very drugs. A recent report in USA Today reveals hospitals across the country are administering medications to patients in labor only to then alert child welfare authorities when their newborns test positive for those very same substances on subsequent drug tests. The Marshall Project investigated and found that the people implicated contained traces of the drugs given to them by hospital personnel, nurses, at times without their knowledge. Medications including fentanyl and morphine used in epidurals, plus different blood pressure medicines given for C-sections.
Surveillance and criminalization of pregnant women has increased since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in June 2022. As a result, hospital reports have led to police calls, child welfare investigations, and even the removal of children from their parents. One such case in Oklahoma that the Marshall Project uncovered found that a woman had her newborn baby and 3 other children removed and put into foster care for 2 weeks. She had tested positive for meth, but it turned out that it was heartburn meds that the hospital administered that was the source of that substance. She was ultimately reunited with her kids.
Yeah, I don't know about that. The only thing there I would disagree with is the uptick versus after Roe v. Wade. I mean, maybe, but I have read tons and tons of these cases over the year at Reason Magazine, where I also work. Lenore Skenazy is a writer there who I work with very closely over the years. She's a good friend of mine. She is the free-range kids person. She wrote a book about that movement, about why kids need more unstructured free time, playtime outside, but she also writes a lot about child services investigations, because often there are cases like that where child services is brought in because someone saw a kid walk into the park by himself and called the authorities, and it's just utterly ridiculous. When I was young, when you were young, it was common to provide kids, healthy to provide the kids this level of unsupervised time. We've totally criminalized this. It's bad for society, bad for the kids, bad for our police resources, and so on and so forth. There are also cases just like this at hospitals where parents either bring in very young children for routine medical issues or for important medical issues, where sometimes it's not even doctors doing it. It's just there's a child abuse specialist at the hospital who will say, oh, this looks like abuse, even if that's just being totally made up. Even if sometimes it's abuse introduced by the hospital staff if they have to perform an important, on a very young baby's body, you can, if you have to intubate them or do things like that, you can introduce bruises. It's sad, but it happens, even in the course of important medical work being done. For then, the child abuse people to turn around and say, oh yeah, the parents must have done this, and they get the baby yanked away at the hospital. It happens all the time. It's terrible. It's a scandal. Because also and then they'll take the other kids. If there's older kids, they'll put them in foster care too. You have to have a pretty actually violent and abusive family life for foster care to be an improvement. Mm-hmm. I will say that.
Yeah, no.
It is being split from your family and your siblings and placed in foster care. It has to be insanely bad for you for that to be a healthier alternative. But in a lot of cases, there's no abuse. It's just imagined by child welfare bureaucrats.
I mean, I just think the nature of such an intimate and personal issue is that there is an enormous propensity for injustice by wrongs on either side. There is obviously to have one's children taken away on the basis of a false allegation of abuse or neglect is obviously catastrophic and totally traumatic, and people who that happens to should seek redress. I assume that some of these measures have grown out of the historic missing of cases of genuine abuse. Certainly, you were talking about when we were young, different mores applying, and certainly the amount of abuse that was swept under the carpet when I was young and later came to light decades later is equally tragic and a terrible injustice to the children who suffered that. In this particular case, and obviously we do have to say we are two men sitting here discussing pregnancy and the complications of pregnancy and the medications that go with pregnancy.
I was born once.
Well, yes, that's a good start. You're an expert in this from the day you were born. But some of these cases, we mentioned the one in Oklahoma, a lot of them do seem terrible. In New York, according to the Marshall Project, a mother with no history of drug abuse lost custody of her toddler and newborn for 5 months after she tested positive for fentanyl that the hospital had given her in an epidural. So these things are awful and terrible thing that has befallen these
it's
families.
Like you eat a poppy seed bagel and muffin, and you have opium.
It's all those kind of things are genuine issues. Now, I guess the Marshall Project is not alleging any nefarious or malevolent intent, but the fact that there are all these substances present in conventional medicines, some of them that are given to pregnant women or to women in the very first days of becoming a mother, that have substances that are in another light can be cast as illicit drug use. That seems obviously a problem, and it seems like something that has to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm looking up Lenore Skenazy's archive. She had several recent stories for us at Reason that were just crazy on this front. An Illinois family, the Brucker family, they had medical complications with their young twins, and so they brought them to the hospital, and they're being treated at the hospital, and then because the X-rays showed that they had problems. That's why they brought them in, and they were just wrongly blamed for I think fractured ribs that were clearly a result of what the doctors were performing on them there. And Child Services came. They took the kids away, and then like a year later made the determination, you're correct, you did not abuse your child. They got the kids back. And the parents their obvious question, well, who did abuse them then? So there was someone at this hospital, some nurse who handled the kid too aggressively. And Child Service said, well, we did substantiate, like in their investigation, they found out who that was, but they just wouldn't tell them. Isn't that crazy? Really? Isn't that appalling?
That's insane.
It's that kind of thing that's just insane.
Yeah.
This was Illinois. I've also seen a lot of cases out of Texas for some reason. You would think Texas would be a state where we firmly assert parents' rights to take care of their kids. No, the Department of Family Services there, or whatever it's called something slightly different in every state.
Yeah.
It's just reprehensible there.
In the case that you mentioned in Illinois, there is the fundamental cruelty of taking the kids away, but then, correct me if I'm wrong, you said the kids were only given back to the parents after a year.
It's like a year.
So, I can't imagine being a kid and being taken away from my parents.
Well, what happens is eventually you work out, you go into foster care immediately, then you work out an arrangement where you're going to live with an aunt or grandma and grandpa, and then your parents can visit you if supervised for a certain amount of time per week, which is just really a humiliating ordeal to go through. You're the parent being told you can only see your children under XYZ circumstances. It's really bad.
Well, also
really
just
bad.
terribly traumatic for the child,
Yes.
presumably, who just has the bond with his or her parents ripped away and dismantled in large extent for no good reason at all.
Indeed. No. Well, tell us what you think about this story, or if you've heard of similar examples in the news, and we'll be back with more Rising right after this.